Carbonara is one of the simplest Italian dishes you can make, but simple is not always easy. And if you're spending your money on fancy imported ingredients, you're gonna wanna get it right the first time, so you don't end up with an expensive plate of scrambled eggs. In this video, I'm gonna quickly go over the 5 ingredients in carbonara to make sure you're spending your money on the good stuff. Then, I'm gonna go through the recipe step by step, focusing on the techniques that help guarantee a smooth and creamy sauce every time. I promise you, this recipe is idiot-proof. And at the end of this video, for those of you who want to take your carbonara to the next level, I'm gonna share not 1, but 2 of my personal tricks for the perfect carbonara. Now, I make these videos to save you time. So if you just came here for the recipe, then just click here. But if you know that a recipe is only as good as its ingredients, then let's go through the 5 ingredients that make up a perfect carbonara, starting with the most important part of any pasta dish, pasta. You may be tempted to flex all of your Italian cooking skills at once for this recipe and use some fresh egg pasta. But trust me, dried pasta is going to be better for carbonara, for 3 reasons. First off, there's going to be a lot of eggs in the sauce, so using an egg-based pasta is just a little bit extra. Second, there's a lot of tossing and stirring in this recipe, so you really do need a dried pasta for that extra durability. And lastly, I just find that dried pasta has a better al dente bite, which creates a better texture in the final dish with a creamy sauce. The typical shapes you'll find with a carbonara in Italy are gonna be spaghetti, rigatoni, and mezzamaniche. But my personal favorite for carbonara is bucatini, because it's just a little bit thicker than spaghetti and has a small hole in the middle that gives it a different bite. Regardless, the recipe for this dish is gonna be the same either way, so choose a shape that you like, and let's move on to the second ingredient, guanciale. Now, unless you've had gricia or amatriciana, carbonara is most people's first experience with guanciale. And when people come back from Italy raving about how great the carbonara is, my guess is it's just because that was their first time having it with actual guanciale. Guanciale is a super fatty pork cheek, or jowl, kind of like the double chin of the pig. It's pretty common in both the USA and Italy to substitute pancetta or bacon because those are more widely available and cost a little bit less as well. But pancetta and bacon are made from a slightly less fatty pork belly, and the flavors are totally different. That's why some people think,
se usi la pancetta, non è una vera carbonara.
It's kind of like substituting a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's kind of the same thing, but I bet you'd notice the difference. Personally, I recommend trying all 3 versions, pancetta, bacon, and guanciale, and see what you like. If you want to go for guanciale, there are a few different types. In Italy, you'll find guanciale that's cured in black pepper and has a kind of black crust to it. You can find this style in the US, but it tends to be expensive, and I typically am able to find it more easily rolled or cured without a crust. In my experience, the outside doesn't really make that much of a difference because you're going to remove it anyway, and the flavors don't really make it all the way into the meat. A difference that I do notice, and my personal favorite, is smoked guanciale. Depending on where you live, this is also called jowl bacon, and if you see it, I definitely recommend giving it a try. So where can you find guanciale? Because it can be tough. The first place I would look is if you have a local Italian deli that imports cheeses and other products, they might have some. And honestly, even though I live in LA where there are lots of Italian delis, I still buy my guanciale online because that's the only place where I can find it smoked, and that's how I like it. But enough about the cheek, let's move on to the cheese. Specifically, Pecorino Romano. Pecorino Romano is a sharp and tangy sheep's cheese that you may know from cacio e pepe. There are pecorino cheeses from all over Italy, but as its name suggests, Pecorino Romano is from the Roman pecora. Even though nowadays, most of this Pecorino Romano is produced on the island of Sardinia. There's just way more room for sheep there. Most Pecorino Romanos are pretty similar, but for the most authentic and creamy carbonara, there is still one Pecorino Romano that is made in Rome, and that is called Fulvi Pecorino Romano, which you can identify by the black wax rind. It's just a little bit softer, creamier, and less salty than other Pecorino Romanos. But honestly, any Pecorino Romano will do just fine. Just get the blocks, please. Don't use any of the pre-grated stuff. But Jokes aside, if you're the one paying for the ingredients, you're the one cooking, and you're the one eating, then really you should just use whatever cheese you'd like. As for me, I like the blocks because some of the pre-shredded or pre-grated cheeses will have other ingredients and anti-caking agents that can affect the flavor and texture of the sauce. I also like buying from imported Italian cheesemakers because that's my way of supporting these artisanal traditions that otherwise could disappear. So that's just me. You do you. Now, this is where things get a little bit controversial because some people think Pecorino Romano cheese is too salty and tangy on its own. So they cut the cheese with a little bit of Parmigiano Reggiano, or the more affordable Grana Padano, which come from cows and are slightly less salty and just more subtle all around. This is where the recipe gets a little bit more flexible on the whole 5-ingredient rule. But I would recommend just following your tongue because there's no sense in making a recipe that's authentic if you don't like the way that it tastes. Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people. And if you watched my last video on the evolution and history of carbonara, you'd know that Parmesan is actually the original cheese for this dish. But most people that I cook for like a blend. So for this recipe, I'm gonna use a 2-to-1 blend of Pecorino Romano and Grana Padano. Next up, eggs. Some people like to only use yolks, but some people just like mostly yolks. A good rule of thumb is 1 yolk per person and then a whole egg for the table to share. So for a recipe with 2 people, that's gonna be 2 yolks and 1 whole egg. But if you scale that up for 6 people, you'll use 6 yolks and still just 1 whole egg. And lastly, a lot of freshly ground black pepper. The only really thing to note here is that it really should be freshly ground for the best flavor. Be generous, but save a little bit for garnish. So now that we have all 5 ingredients and you've spent a small fortune on imported meat, imported cheese, and just normal eggs, how do you make sure you get the recipe right so it all doesn't go to waste? Well, all you have to do is follow this foolproof, easy to master, flawless, creamy carbonara every time recipe for dummies. Like always, the full recipe with measurements and conversions is in the description. So I'm not gonna waste time saying grams, ounces, cups, and tablespoons 100 times, and you can just focus on these steps and techniques that go into a perfect carbonara. Now, if you're making it right, which we are, the sauce for this dish comes together in the same amount of time it takes to boil water and cook pasta. So once you start heating up the water, you should also start frying your guanciale, or pancetta, or bacon, whatever you like. If you're using guanciale though, you should remove the hard outer skin or pellicule like I mentioned before. It's tough and sometimes not fully clean. Better safe than sorry. Then slice some slices into little blocks. I like getting a little bit of meat and fat on each block, but don't worry if you end up with a couple little fat cubes. They'll render down and become crispy little flavor bombs in the final sauce. Note, you want to cook the meat on low. You can start with some oil, but you don't need to. The fat will start to render and soon you'll have brown crispy pork bits frying in the rich guanciale grease. Just keep the heat on low until they're crispy on the outside, but still soft on the inside. Then just set them to the side to cool down and throw in your pasta. While the pasta cooks, separate 1 yolk per person and an egg for the table. Then add the grated cheeses and freshly ground black pepper in a large metal or glass bowl, as long as it's heat-proof. Trust me, it'll matter for later and it'll save you some dishes, which is always a good thing. At this point, you may need to add some pasta water to loosen up the egg and cheese mixture, but while you add it, make sure you are constantly stirring so that the heat from the water doesn't cook the eggs. Or if you really like the taste of guanciale, now that it's cooled down, you can add some of the leftover guanciale grease as well. I normally use it all unless I have a specific recipe that I'm saving it for later. Either way, do not just throw that away. It is liquid gold and has tons of creative uses in other recipes. At this point, the pasta should be done, so it's time to toss in the sauce. But this is where most people have issues with their sauce getting chunky or melty. When you're making any sauce with eggs, the key is to gently raise the temperature to the point where the eggs begin to thicken and pasteurize, but you don't want them to get too hot too fast and solidify or scramble. The ideal temperature window for eggs is between 149 and 158 degrees Fahrenheit, or 65 and 70 degrees Celsius. And the cool thing about carbonara in particular is that temperature target is the same one you want for your cheese to start breaking down but not melt together. But to achieve this level of precision, you don't need a thermometer or a particular set of skills. You just need a heat-proof bowl to make what's known as a double boiler, bain-marie, or
bain-marie.
Because with a double boiler, or
Bain-marie,
the steam from the pasta water heats the sauce through the bowl, and steam always maxes out at the temperature of boiling water. So the bowl maintains an even and low temperature regardless of how hot your stove is. That brings everything in the bowl up to temp with a smooth and soft landing right in that temperature sweet spot. After the eggs and cheese come together, the sauce may get too thick, so just pull it off the heat and add a tiny splash of pasta water. Not too much, because you can always add more. Then just keep stirring and tossing until everything is nice and creamy. Last of all, just before serving and when the sauce is already finished, then I like to add the guanciale so that it's still crispy. You can even save a bit for a final garnish along with more Pecorino Romano and black pepper. Now this may look like the perfect carbonara, but it can still be improved. And for that, I recommend these optional but totally awesome tricks. First, toasting the pepper in guanciale oil before grinding it. You'll need a mortar and pestle for this because putting greasy peppercorns into a pepper mill isn't really good for the pepper mill. But if you're counting along, this whole recipe just uses one pot, one pan, and one bowl. So adding a few extra dirty dishes isn't that bad. Next, whether you're making a single portion or a huge batch, one of the biggest issues that you'll encounter is going to be temperature control. Like I mentioned before, if the sauce is too hot, it'll cook the eggs. But if the sauce is too cold, then by the time it gets to the table, you'll end up with a thick, eggy mush. This last trick solves both of those problems. Before adding the hot pasta water to the sauce, pour it onto your serving plate. It'll warm up the plate to keep your pasta warmer for longer and cool down the water so you don't cook your eggs. Win-win.